All right, last week we talked a little bit about a future guy that John called the Antichrist and the Beast, and we determined that he was going to be a dictator. So let's begin by spending a few moments talking about how dictators are made. You see, dictators don't simply show up one day and say, okay, gang, let's do away with this old-fashioned democracy. From now on, I'm going to tell you what to do. In fact, dictators rarely force themselves onto anyone. And once a totalitarian system has been put into place, short of an all-out war, it's almost impossible to get rid of. Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela in 1999 with almost 57% of the vote. At first, he did some good things for the people, but before long, he nationalized most of the key industries in Venezuela. He revised the constitution in his favor. He declared economic war on Venezuela's upper class so that most of them left the country and took their money with them. His economic policies, such as deficit spending and price controls, created shortages and eventually destroyed the economy, so poverty and inflation increased to the point that people are now forced to go to the town dumps to hunt for food. He took over the press, he manipulated election laws to guarantee his victory in future elections, and he arrested and deported anyone who criticized his government. And under his administration, crime skyrocketed, and his government officials as well as the police force became so corrupt that they were basically useless. Well, the only thing that got Chavez out of office was his death in 2013. And his successor, Vice President Nicolas Maduro, turned out to be much worse than Chavez ever was. In 2012, the Wall Street Journal claimed that Maduro was, quote, the most capable administrator and politician of Chavez's inner circle. Well, his economic policies have driven Venezuela's economy to crisis levels. And as a result, Maduro's popularity tanked and riots broke out all over the country in 2014. According to the New York Times, again, quote, Maduro's administration was held responsible for grossly mismanaging the economy and plunging the country into a deep humanitarian crisis and attempting to crush the opposition by jailing or exiling critics and using lethal force against anti-government protesters. A National Assembly that opposed Maduro was elected in 2015, and a movement that began to remove Maduro from office in 2016. But at the next election, a totally pro-Maduro legislation was elected under what many people have called a very irregular voting conditions. But this new legislature passed a mandate that allowed Maduro to retain his office. Well, a special election was held in 2018 in another attempt to remove Maduro, and the vote count showed that Maduro had won. But after the election, it was discovered that the voting machines that had been rigged to miscount the votes, and the investigation showed that Maduro had actually lost the election, but he refused to leave office. And his presidency is not recognized by most countries today, and he is ruling under a legislative mandate. Well, guess what? The same company that supplied those rigged voting machines to Maduro also supplied most of the voting machines that were used in our presidential election in 2020. And investigations have shown that a lot of them were rigged to not count or change Republican votes. So why am I telling you all this? Remember, Hugo Chavez was welcomed with open arms when he was elected. Well, so far, all efforts to remove his legacy that have been led by the people of Venezuela haven't been able to get rid of the socialist government that he created. You see, dictators will prevent that from happening by disarming their subjects and then creating a national police force that isn't there to protect the people, it's there to protect the government from the people. That's why our founders were smart enough to give us the Second Amendment. Today, instead of using our own oil, Joe Biden is in Venezuela on his hands and knees, begging Maduro to bail him out by producing more oil. Ever wonder why Japan and Germany never attacked the United States mainland during World War II? It was because they knew that almost every citizen in the United States was armed and would fight. Now, once a dictator is established, there may be power struggles and a new dictator may gain control by force. But that usually isn't how the dictatorship is initially instituted. In fact, quite the opposite is true. As crazy as it sounds, the people are usually the ones who will force the dictator to rule over them. Adolf Hitler was the ruler of Nazi Germany during World War II, and he gained his power peacefully. The fact is, Hitler never would have gained power in Germany if it wasn't for the economic turmoil that was in Europe during the 1920s and 1930s. There was a great despair among the people. The world was in the middle of an economic depression. Millions of people were out of work. Businesses were failing all over the world. In Germany, the money was so worthless that it actually took a wheelbarrow full of it to buy a loaf of bread. While I was editing this lesson, I happened to run across a picture of some pre-war German kids who had glued a bunch of German marks together in large sheets and were using them to build kites. That's how worthless the money was. It wasn't worth the cost of the paper that it was printed on. Because of the sanctions placed on Russia after the invasion of the Ukraine, the Russian ruble is now worth less than a U.S. penny. When things like that happen, people are willing to sell their souls to the devil for a way out. Hitler felt that the time was right to seize power, so he promised the people security. And he delivered on that promise by building a massive army. He promised economic prosperity, and building the machines of war put people back to work. To the German people, Hitler was their hero. They looked at him as their savior of the country. It was too late before they saw him for the monster that he really was. Before his rule was over, he had murdered over 12 million people in the death camps of Europe, and half of them were Jews. But as bad as Hitler was, compared to the socialist communist leaders in the world, he was an amateur. Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists have murdered over 65 million people. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet communists have murdered over 20 million people. Kim Jong-il and his son Kim Jong-un in North Korea and Pol Pot in Cambodia have murdered 2 million people each. To date, the number of people that have been murdered by communist regimes worldwide has numbered over 100 million people. And as of today, not a single responsible official has ever been tried or punished for the crimes against humanity. But in a recent poll in the United States, 46% of the people said that they have a favorable view of communism. Even though communists promised a utopian society where working people will enjoy unprecedented prosperity, in reality, all they've ever managed to create was massive poverty and tyranny. Whenever communists gain control, freedom dies and the economy collapses and the bloodshed begins. Communist countries are the only ones who have to build walls to keep their people from escaping. Capitalist countries have to build walls to keep people out. Roman emperors were worshipped as gods, but they didn't originally ask to be worshipped. When Rome would take over a country, they would very often throw out a petty tyrant who ruled there. Well, the first thing the Romans would do for the people would be to set up a system of Roman justice. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than what they had before the Romans arrived. Then they would post Roman soldiers in the area and supplement them with soldiers recruited from the local population, and these soldiers functioned in two ways. First, they would keep the local population in check, and second, they would protect the people from attacks coming from bands of marauders or by the armies of countries that the Rome had not defeated yet. You see, their presence gave stability and security to the people. This became known as the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. So in many cases, the people in these conquered countries didn't really see themselves as conquered people. They looked at the Romans as their liberators, and they were grateful for what they had done. One big exception to this was Israel. So the Romans saw Israel as the problem child. Well, for the rest of the Roman world, they started to worship the symbol of Roman power, and that would be the emperor. It was only later that the Roman emperors actually started to demand that worship. The point is this: it's anxiety, poverty, fear, lawlessness, and human despair that creates dictators. These are the conditions that create the atmosphere of false hero worship that is required before a dictator can rise to power. Then, in order to retain power in the name of maintaining peace, the dictator must control every aspect of the life of the people. And they do that by coercion, threats, and murder, and they become a way of life. This is why leftists try so hard to create division and chaos in America. Their hope is, once the people get tired of it, they'll run to the liberals, begging them to take over and stop the chaos. And at that point, they're willing to give up their freedom for this false sense of security. We saw a glimpse of this when the government started to force people to do ridiculous things in the name of protecting them from COVID-19. They willingly gave up their freedom for the false hope and security against that virus. Liberals became drunk on their newfound power, and they're still trying to keep that power by trying to continue these mandates. That's why Justin Trudeau refused to lift the mandates in Canada, even though every local government in North America has already done it. Now, let's slow down for just a moment and take a good, hard, realistic look at the world today. We might be shocked by what we see. The world population is expected to grow by 32% over the next 50 years, but the Muslim population is expected to grow by 70%. It won't be long before Muslims in this country will be able to win every U.S. election. Crime has become increasing at a rate of 150% a year. There has not been a single day since 1925 that a war has not raged somewhere on this planet, and look at where our priorities are. Did you know that we spent more money last year on lipstick and eyeshadow than we did on medical research? Young people are entering mental institutions at a rate of 700% higher than their share of the population. The second highest cause of death among teenagers today is suicide. The third highest cause of death is drug overdose. And the number one cause of death among people under 20 years of age is drunk driving accidents. We're living in a world that's obsessed with violence. As a result, we are becoming more violent as a society because we have become callous to it. Life no longer has any value for us. Did you know that before the average child reaches the age of 18, they have witnessed over 50,000 murders on television, and that figure does not count the walking wounded. 1 out of every 4 women has had an abortion. 35% of all pregnancies in New York City end up in abortion. For African American women, more babies are killed in abortion clinics today than are actually born. Well, aside from the fact that 1.5 million babies are killed in abortion clinics every year, an equally unfortunate result of Roe versus Wade decision was legalized abortion on demand, is the message that it sends to our young people. It diminishes the value of human life. Combine that with the Darwinian idea that we are just an accident of nature that has no more value than the pond scum that we're supposed to have evolved from, and you can see why people today don't value human life. Dr. Jack Kevorkian, in his push for assisted suicide, does the same thing. It makes life a disposable commodity. Wherever life becomes inconvenient, it can be ended. Now, I can sympathize with people who would rather die than suffer. I feel that same way myself, but I prefer to let God decide when that's going to happen. I have a living will that tells doctors not to keep me alive beyond the point where there is no hope for my recovery, but I will let God decide the moment that I will die. But if this assisted suicide thing catches on like abortion did and it becomes big business, you're going to start seeing people being encouraged to let someone assist them to commit suicide so that the person assisting them can collect a fee. This is already happening in Denmark, where assisted suicide is legal. A recent study showed that 80% of the elderly people who were euthanized didn't really want to die. Someone else decided that they should die, and they just went along with them. Kevorkian has assisted in several suicides where the autopsy discovered that the person didn't actually have the terminal disease that they thought they had. And he was eventually convicted of second-degree murder. He died in 2011. This cheapening of life can already be seen in our young people. There's a story of a teenager in New Jersey who had a baby in the ladies' room during the senior prom. She's accused of throwing the baby in the trash can and returning to the dance. Now, how can you tell her that she could get the death penalty for killing her baby when she could have gone to an abortion clinic a week earlier and killed the baby legally? There have been several cases like this in recent years. How about Marcus Lloyd, who was convicted of murdering his pregnant girlfriend? Prosecutors charge him with killing 2 people, his girlfriend and her unborn baby. Seems like a double standard to me. How can you call what he did murder when his girlfriend could have gone to an abortion clinic the same day and killed the baby legally? On the other hand, you have abortionists who insist that an unborn baby is nothing more than a tissue mass. But did you know that that baby has a beating heart and fingerprints before most women even know that they're pregnant? But at the same time, prosecutors will charge someone who isn't an abortionist with murder if they killed that unborn baby. Well, what's the next step? If unborn babies are going to be disposable items, how about when you get older? That's what that mother in South Carolina thought a few years ago when she drove her car into the ocean with her 2 boys strapped in the seats. It just wasn't convenient for her to keep them anymore. Well, animal shelters do unborn puppies and kittens today, don't they? And aren't people just animals, and we're lucky enough to evolve the big brain? An Anglican bishop in England issued a statement back in November that said that doctors should be allowed to kill babies that are born with severe genetic disorders like Down syndrome. That came from a leader in the church, folks. The Presbyterian Church USA was in favor of abortion on demand. But 9 years ago, they sort of tempered their stand on abortion. Today, our denomination says that abortion should be discouraged, but at the same time, they still endorse a woman's right to have one if that's what she wants. Now, personally, I don't see much difference. Either way, the baby's still dead. But what happens when we apply the same logic to adults? What if we legalize the killing of Alzheimer's patients? Then we'll move on to include anybody who doesn't meet the quality of life standards that we feel every adult person should meet. Who knows? Maybe adult survivors in wheelchairs won't have that criteria, or won't meet that criteria. Does that sound like anybody you know? You see, life has become cheap to us. It's becoming a disposable commodity. A movie called Logan's Run was released in 1976. It told the story of a doomed city where everyone had to be executed on their 30th birthday. This attitude toward life is even encouraged by some of our school systems. Some school systems in this country are using what is known as values clarification as a part of their curriculum. One exercise is called the Lifeboat. In this exercise, 5th graders are given this scenario. You are in a lifeboat that is designed to hold 10 people, but there are 11 people in the boat and there is a storm coming up. So they're afraid that the boat might be swamped by the storm unless they can lighten the boat by throwing one person overboard. The idea is it's better for one person to die in the storm than all 11. Well, at that point, they'll go through and tell those little minds full of mush a little bit about each person on the boat. One is an 87-year-old man, one is a famous doctor, there's a very fat lady, and another is a criminal, and so on. Then the kids have to decide which person they will throw overboard and why they chose that person. Of course, the idea that they could all stick together is discouraged as being impractical. And they're encouraged to choose the one that they think will contribute the least to society, like the old man or the criminal. Or they're encouraged to take the practical approach and throw the fat lady out. I mean, after all, she's the one who adds the most weight to the boat. What this really is a lesson in situational ethics. And they're doing this with 10 and 11-year-old children. How about our movies? Do you think that it's enjoyable to go to a theater and watch people be hacked to pieces? The Romans did that in the Colosseum, and we called them barbarians. But movies that show that sort of violence are among the biggest hits today, especially among teenagers. And don't think for a moment that the theaters are turning the kids away just because they're underage. If you believe that, I'll bet you believe in the Tooth Fairy too. And let's not forget video games. The more violent the game is, the better they seem to like it. At least the Romans watch from a distance. Today we participate. We get close-ups. We shoot someone and watch the blood splatter. The makers of these movies and video games claim that what kids watch on TV and in the theaters does not affect what they do. Well, if that's true, why do they spend billions of dollars every year on TV advertisements that are designed to get kids to buy their products? How about the dysfunctional family? I mean, the Simpsons aren't that far from reality. Over half of all marriages end in divorce within 7 years. The national average is 52%, but in Florida it's 62%. And that's assuming that they bothered to get married in the first place. The latest figures I've seen show that among the couples who are living together as man and wife, the ones that are actually married are in the minority now. Add to the divorce numbers, the breakups between unmarried couples, and the figure goes through the roof. And on the day that I wrote that sentence, there were 3 cases where an unmarried couple broke up when one partner tried to murder the other. The actress Goldie Hawn was the subject of an article in the Columbia Dispatch a few years ago. The columnist wrote, Goldie Hawn, pregnant with her third child, says that she and her live-in lover, Kurt Russell, have no plans to tie the knot because marriage is ridiculous. Later in that same article, Hawn is quoted as saying, what are you investing in? Concepts. But concepts are broken with the snap of a finger. That's why I think marriage is ridiculous. The accepted norm today is to live together and have a few kids, and then if it looks like that's what you want, you get married. But you only stay married until something better comes along. Seems like we're putting the cart of family responsibility before the horse of commitment. Ask yourself, are we living in peaceful times? Are we living in prosperous times? Are we free of tension? Are we free of economic troubles? I think it's obvious that we're living in a less than ideal age. The conditions are growing increasingly better for a dictator to take over. Another trait that we see in the world today is a marked lack of charismatic leadership. Now, I'm not speaking about the charismatic movements in the church today. What I'm referring to is a lack of people who have that special charisma that instills loyalty in the people that they lead and wins the respect of other world leaders. There are no Winston Churchills or George Washingtons, Abraham Lincolns, Martin Luther Kings, or Margaret Thatchers in the world today. About as close as we've come in the last 30 years has been Donald Trump. But the political world hates him because he happens to be a strong leader that they can't manipulate. And for those people, Joe Biden is them doing cartwheels all over Washington because he doesn't know what day of the week it is. So he'll do whatever his keepers tell him to do. Now, don't get me wrong, I feel sorry for anyone who has to deal with dementia, but I would prefer that that person is not President of the United States. You don't have to be a particularly religious person to realize that the conditions in the world today are setting the stage for a dictator to seize power. This whole concept is very hard for Americans to comprehend because our system of selecting our leaders has been pretty reliable and peaceful. But even that is under attack today. But if you look closely at the world as a whole, you'll see that that statement like that isn't as far-fetched as you might think. Not too long ago, there was a political leader in Europe who literally swept the people off their feet. He gained almost universal praise and admiration. He wasn't a particularly forceful man, nor was he a particularly gifted orator. In fact, the politician who captured the imagination of the world was a rather mediocre guy. Most Americans have probably never heard his name. His name was Edouard Belladier, and he was the Prime Minister of France from 1993 to 1995 when he retired from public spotlight. He spent most of his career as an obscure civil servant who didn't possess the kind of charisma that you would expect to see in a person who would be so universally praised. But the fact is, France's leading political cartoonist portrayed Belladier as walking on water. A popular TV puppet show mimicked his regular calls for trust and patience by depicting him as a hypnotist who put the nation to sleep. An American newspaper said that he could give Ronald Reagan Teflon lessons. The point is this: Belladier is a good example of how fast someone can rise to power in this topsy-turvy world. Just look at how governments are changing in most of the world today. Who would ever dream that the Soviet Union would collapse, or that Germany would reunite, or that Yugoslavia would break up and become Croatia and Slovenia, or that the second largest economy in the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela, would elect a socialist government to turn that country into a poverty-stricken hellhole. The fact is, the world economic system is set up to allow a dictator to take over. How many of you have ever heard of the organization known as the Trilateral Commission? The Trilateral Commission is a non-elected group of some of the most powerful people in the world today, and it has its offices in Manhattan. Now, we're not going to get into a long discussion about the commission itself, and I'm not one of those conspiracy theorists who say that the Trilateral Commission is this shady organization that really runs the world. But the economic system that it established has changed the world forever. This is basically how it works. There has always been a need for some sort of a system to regulate world trade. For most of the world history, the stronger nations would control world trade by using boycotts and tariffs. If a particular nation didn't toe the line, the larger countries would impose tariffs and boycotts on their goods and destroy their economies. After World War II, it became obvious that this system would no longer work. So, world powers began to manipulate the value of their currencies in order to weaken one another and to protect their own economies. And the tariffs that were being imposed were actually doing more to restrict trade than they were doing to encourage trade. So a new system was needed. Well, two of the world's most brilliant economists, John Keynes of Great Britain and Harry White of the United States, met in July of 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The result of that meeting was the creation of two organizations, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These organizations would fix currency exchange rates. You see, by having a third party doing this, it prevented the strong nations from manipulating rates for their advantage. The result was a more stable world economy. There was another power given to the group that nobody wants to admit to. The World Bank could provide or deny credit to the poorer nations. This was basically a share the wealth type of system. World trade was regulated by establishing a most favored nation system of trade, play by the rules and you would get this status. Book the system and you'd be denied that status, which forces your country to pay tariffs and penalties in order to do business, which would make you less competitive. Not playing by the rules also meant a loss of credit privileges at the World Bank. Now, the enforcer of the Bretton Woods system was the United States. The U.S. dollar was already being used as the unofficial world currency. The dollar was stable. It was backed by a strong economy. And at the time, it was backed by the gold that was deposited in Fort Knox. But Bretton Woods began to fall apart in the early 1960s. As the U.S. went farther into debt, the U.S. dollar was beginning to lose its stability. The liberals in Congress had created all sorts of entitlement programs that would put a drain on the economy, such as Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. The national debt was growing out of control, and as we speak, the Democrats want to raise it even more. And this causes out-of-control inflation. You see, we don't have the money to spend. We are already in debt to the tune of $31 trillion, so we just print more money. But the more money you have in circulation, the less that money is worth. And the result is it costs more to buy everything you buy. Add to that the skyrocketing cost of fuel, which increases transportation costs that will affect the cost of everything you buy, and people start to struggle. And the resident idiots in Washington are the ones who created this problem and refuse to do anything to stop it. Inflation is sometimes referred to as the invisible tax, and it hits poor people the hardest. The trade deficit was beginning to get lopsided as we began to import more and more than we exported, and the currency was no longer backed by the gold standard. And the European Union, as well as the growing industries in Japan and China, were starting to offer a real competition to the United States, and more competition they had seen since World War II. Well, in 1973, into that failing system stepped two men, David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. They created a whole new economic system that would revolve around three groups. The Orient, led by Japan, with China is now taking over. Europe, led by the European Common Market, which became the European Union. And North America, led by the United States. They called their group the Trilateral Commission since it was controlled by these three spheres of world trade. This group controls over 70% of the world's trade. With that kind of power, the Trilateral Commission would have no problem at all enforcing the Bretton Woods agreements. And the people who are members of the Commission are powerful enough to rule the world with or without the Trilateral Commission. Also, as per this agreement, the world no longer trades in dollars. Instead, they now use a new system of world currency known as SDRs, special drawing rights. This idea is even being introduced into the private sector. The talk today is about a totally cashless society. I'm sure that most of you carry a debit card. Instead of cash, you would be issued a card that works something like a debit card does today, except you won't control it. It will be controlled by the government. Your pay will be automatically deposited into your account. Whenever you buy something, you can run the card through a scanner, and the funds will automatically be transferred from your account to the store's account, and many stores are doing this today. But eventually, that will be the only way that you'll be able to buy anything, and the new world currency will be something like Bitcoin. Now, at first glance, that might sound perfectly innocent. After all, many of us are doing it today, but with a capital B, just stop and think about the control that a system like that would give a government over the people it governed. At the push of a button, they would be able to tell where you spend every dime of your money. At the push of a few more buttons, they could cut off your card and seize all your assets. And by pushing the right button, they could manipulate anyone they wanted to and force them to do anything they wanted them to do. Justin Trudeau did this to the truckers in Canada. He seized their bank accounts and everything they own because they refused to do what he told them to do. The Biden administration is already talking about nationalizing all private retirement accounts. So they want your IRA and 401k to be absorbed into Social Security because the idiots in Washington spent all the money that was meant to be the nest egg that kept Social Security solvent. Well, the Bible predicted that the Antichrist will have that kind of power. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The Trilateral Commission has also expanded into the area of politics. If the name Zbigniew Brzezinski sounds familiar, it should. He was the chief of staff in the White House during the Carter administration. How do you think that a relatively unknown peanut farmer from Georgia named Jimmy Carter became president of the United States? He is a card-carrying member of the Trilateral Commission, and the commission backed his candidacy. George H.W. Bush is also a card-carrying member. Bill Clinton is also a member, and George W. Bush is a member. And that's why the establishment elite hate Donald Trump so much. He isn't a member, and they can't control him. These people are powerful enough to merit paying attention to. The influence of this group is also starting to be felt in world politics. They're placing commission members into key positions in governments of many of the countries around the world. Well, the power of the Trilateral Commission was greatly expanded in 1994 when a 26,000-page treaty known as the Final Act of the Uruguayan Round was very quietly given for informal approval by 124 nations at a meeting in Marrakesh, Morocco. This is a document that dwarfs the very controversial North American Free Trade Agreement known as Nafta. Basically, this agreement would slash import taxes, and it would open markets for food and consumer goods. Now, on the surface, that may sound okay, but the downside is this. Like NAFTA, it creates a worldwide governing organization. This one is called the World Trade Organization, and it locks countries into rules that actually have more authority than their own constitutions. Their meetings tend to show up in the news because radical lefties like to protest at these meetings since this group promotes capitalism. Donald Trump got rid of NAFTA and created a more equitable group called the Usmca, which stands for the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Well, for the chance at some monetary gain, the countries have signed on to the World Trade Organization, agree to give up some of their independence and their autonomy. And the United States is a member of this group. The World Trade Organization has replaced the old General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade known as GATT. It also serves in a similar capacity as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The Trilateral Commission is heavily involved in the operation of those two organizations. So in that sense, they rule the world by controlling the world economy. And of necessity, the influence of the United States has to be diminished. In fact, that was really one of the goals of the group. And it's supported by globalists like Joe Biden and most Democrats who want to see one world government along with a world currency that they can control. For example, in 1947, when GATT was ratified, the U.S. controlled over 50% of the $25 billion of world trade. Today, even though the pie is much larger, it's $3.6 trillion, the United States only controls 15% of it. In the last 20 years, Europe and Japan have actually become more important to the world economy than the United States is. Almost everything Americans buy are made in the Orient. If you want to destroy America, just cut off that supply line. The only reason that hasn't happened yet is because for the moment, they need us more than we need them. Well, why am I telling you all this? Simple, control the World Trade Organization and you control the world. And I believe that it's very possible for these organizations or ones like them and the world systems that they create to be the means that the Antichrist will use to gain power. Well, after gaining control of that organization or one like it, the next step would be to move into power over one of the three spheres of influence in the world economy. And the most logical choice would be the European Union. This will fulfill the prophecy that the Antichrist will come out of the cultural heritage of the Roman Empire. In Daniel chapter 9, he predicts that the Messiah will be cut off, and then the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, in that case, Daniel was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem that took place in 70 A.D. The people who did this were the Romans. And the prince who is to come is the Antichrist. So the Antichrist must come out of the cultural heritage of the old Roman Empire, which is Europe. It would be difficult for a non-Asian to gain control of the eastern sphere dominated by China and Japan, and the premise is the influence of the United States is going to decline. If you control the European Union and the World Trade Organization, the United States won't have as much of a choice but to go along for the ride. Japan is out of the equation simply because of its size, and China has too many internal problems that require outside help. And the problem number one is supplying food for its people. Another reason that the European Union is a prime takeover candidate is the fact that the president of the parliament is appointed and he's not elected. With control of the World Trade Organization, the Antichrist could simply have himself appointed president and we'd be off and running. The three nations that are supposed to oppose his appointment might simply be thrown out of the group, and that would ruin their economies. And besides, Daniel's prophecy clearly states that the Antichrist is going to control the revived Roman Empire, and the European Union is the only group that fills that requirement. Okay, what will the world dictator be like? Well, we're introduced to him in Revelation chapter 13. Let's look at verses 1 and 2. In this passage, he's called the Beast. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on his heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and his mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragons gave his power and his throne and great authority. All right, let's look at this passage a little more closely. He rises from the sea. Some people claim that refers to the Mediterranean Sea, but we find out later that it's not. The Antichrist is going to rise out of the turmoil of the world, more specifically the Gentile world. In Revelation 17, the angel tells John, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. He has 10 horns with 10 crowns. The Greek word is diadema. It's pronounced diadem in English. These are the crowns that were worn by kings. The beast had 7 heads. Now remember the beast in Daniel's dream. Each horn represents a kingdom, and each kingdom represents a king who is the ruler of that kingdom. This is the 10-nation confederacy that will be the seat of the Antichrist power. We also find out in Revelation chapter 17 that the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are several cities in the world that are built on 7 hills, but the most well-known of these is Rome. Now, this can be referring to the cultural heritage of the beast, which is the old Roman Empire. But since it mentions in conjunction with the prostitute, which represents the apostate church, and it says that she sits on the hills, does that refer to the Roman Catholic Church? Well, throughout history, students of Bible prophecy have been speculating that the beast might have some connection to the Roman Catholic Church. Some even think that the Antichrist is going to be a pope. And this didn't go unnoticed by Pope John Paul II. There were those who have studied Pope John Paul II and his writings have actually gone so far as to warn that his successor might actually be the Antichrist. That would mean that the Antichrist would have been Joseph Ratzinger, better known as Pope Benedict XVI. Of course, that didn't happen, but don't give up yet. You see, Ratzinger is the only pope in history to resign as pope and retire, and he is still alive today at the age of 94. So, is the Antichrist going to be a Roman Catholic pope? Who knows? Maybe it's Pope Francis. Francis sure doesn't see that what's written in the Bible as something that we need to pay attention to. Just a few weeks ago, he said that all religions are equally valid and equally true, so Catholics need to honor every religion because each one worships the same God. But the reason that they're different is because God has chosen to reveal himself to different groups in different ways. So far, he hasn't explained how the same God can call Christians and Jews his children and then tell Muslims to kill them. The author and Catholic priest named Malachi Martin wrote this in his book called The Keys to the Blood. Most frighteningly for Paul, he had come up against the irremovable presence, malign strength of his own Vatican and in certain bishop chancelleries. It was what knowledgeable churchmen called superforce, rumors, always difficult to verify, tied its installation to the beginning of Pope Paul VI's reign in 1963. Indeed, Paul had alluded somberly to the smoke of Satan which had entered the sanctuary. This is an oblique reference to the enthronement ceremony of satanic pedophilia rites and practices which has already been documented among certain bishops and priests as widely dispersed as Turin in Italy and South Carolina in the United States. The cultic acts of satanic pedophilia are considered by professionals to be the culmination of the fallen archangel's rites. Pedophilia within the Roman Catholic Church has been a problem for decades. Thousands of priests have been arrested, and the Church has paid out billions of dollars in court settlements. One investigation in France turned up 260,000 children that had been sexually abused by priests. And that was only one country. In 2006, Mark Honigsbaum wrote this in The Guardian. Despite the National Review Board's own estimates that there have been more than 5,000 abusive priests in the United States to date, 150 have been successfully prosecuted. He went on to explain that the reason that there aren't more arrests is because the church covers up the abuse by moving the abusive priest to another location and then bringing pressure on the accusers to keep quiet. So when the abuse is finally discovered, the church refuses to cooperate with the police. And this hinders their investigations, and as a result, by the time enough evidence is really gathered to prosecute the particular case, the statute of limitations is usually run out. This is one reason why there is a shortage of priests today. Now, just as a footnote here, John Paul II was convinced that he would live to see Jesus return to his church. Of course, that didn't happen. The point is this: more and more church leaders think that the rapture of the church is very near. And one more reason to believe that they may be right is that one of the signs that points to his imminent return is the pale horse of pestilence that God will send to this earth. And COVID-19 pandemic sure fits the bill. But again, that's pure speculation. Okay, if you're paying attention last week, you'll recognize the leopard, the bear, and the lion. These are the animals that were in Daniel's vision. And we saw that they represented the three great world empires that led up to the last world empire, Rome. Well, why are they showing up here? They're here to show that the kingdom that the Antichrist is going to rule over will have all the characteristics of the kingdoms that have gone before it. The Antichrist kingdom will be as regal and rich as Babylon was, represented by the lion. It will be as powerful as the Medo-Persian Empire, represented by the bear. It will come to the world prominence as quickly as the Greek Empire did, represented by the leopard. And his leader will get his throne, his power, and his authority from the dragon. Well, who is the dragon? We're told who it is in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Everything that the Antichrist is or has is going to come directly from Satan. In essence, he is going to be Satan incarnate. Well, the obvious question is this: is all this power Satan's to give away? The answer is yes. In Luke chapter 4, Satan offered the same thing to Jesus. In verse 6, Satan says to Jesus, "To you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I give it to whom I will." Well, when Satan said that, Jesus didn't tell him he was wrong. Of course, we all know that Jesus did not accept the offer, But at this point, we're dealing with a man who is going to say yes. And as a result, he is going to be worshipped as Satan is worshipped. Revelation 13 verse 4 says, "And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast." It's no secret that Satan worship is increasing at an alarming rate today. I don't think that anyone would disagree with that statement. But did you know that many people are worshiping Satan today? They don't even know it. They may not worship him directly, but they're involved in things that Satan has created and God has condemned, like Ouija boards, tarot cards, Dragons and Dungeon games, witchcraft, horoscopes, fortune tellers, and things like that. Just look at any bookstore. You'll find racks of books dealing with the occult, witchcraft, and hundreds of other occult topics, including Satan worship as a religion. There are churches in this country today that enjoy tax-exempt status as churches dedicated to the worship of Satan. There are covens of witches operating in every major city in the world. Look at them, how people flock to see movies dealing with demons and Satan. Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, Damien, The Demon Seed, The Exorcist, The Amityville Horror, The Entity, Hellraiser, The Devil's Advocate, Little Nicky, and let's not forget Hellboy, where the son of Satan is turned into one of the good guy superheroes. The beast will be worshipped in the same way that Satan is worshipped. Okay, how will the Antichrist make his grand entrance? Revelation 13 verse 3 says, "One of the heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but his mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast." The Antichrist is going to have what appears to be a fatal head wound, but Satan is going to heal it. In other words, it's going to look as though he has been resurrected from the dead. Of course, Satan isn't capable of actually doing this, so it's going to be faked. Notice that the scripture says, seemed to have a mortal wound, but fake or not, the whole world is going to marvel at this. He'll be an instant celebrity. Now think back to the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963. Can you imagine how the world would have reacted if the President of the United States had been declared dead and suddenly came back to life? Or how about if something like that happened to the Pope? An event like that would shake the world. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen. And this event will give the Antichrist the notoriety that he needs to gain power. Now, some people claim that this scripture is referring to one of the nations in the old Roman Empire that will suddenly come back to power. That is a possible interpretation. I don't happen to agree with it, and here's why. Revelation 13, verses 13 and 14, talks about the false prophet when it says, "He performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of the people. And by signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image of the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived." The people are told to make a statue of the beast and worship it. You don't make a statue of a country, but you can make a statue of a man. Also in Daniel chapter 7, we saw that the horn that represents the beast has the face of a man. None of the other horns did. This is why I feel that we're dealing with a man and not necessarily a nation. Now there is a nation involved, but the focus is going to be on the man that rules it. Now, when this world leader appears, Satan is going to give him so much power that he'll be able to promise peace and security to the entire world. Revelation 13 verse 4 says, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" This is important because the nation of Israel is going to fall for this. And they're going to make a pact with this dictator, thinking that he's going to protect them. Daniel mentions it in chapter 9 verse 27 of his prophecy. Isaiah calls it a covenant with death. We're going to get into this a little bit deeper in a few weeks. Now, about 3.5 years after the Antichrist comes to power, he is going to go to Jerusalem, and in the newly constructed temple, or maybe even at the temple dedication itself, he's going to declare himself to be God. Paul wrote, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." Now, how can anyone believe such a claim while there are still true Christians in the church? And the answer is much simpler than you might think. But there won't be any true Christians left in the church. True Christians would have stopped it if they were there. All of the true Christians would have been taken up to heaven in the rapture. Okay, how long would the Antichrist rule? The answer is in Revelation 13, verse 5. And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. That's 3.5 years. That will be the last half of the period of time that we call the Great Tribulation. Daniel said that he would rule until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. The time of the Great Tribulation will end when Christ returns to the earth, and that event will mark the end of the reign of the Antichrist. Fact is, there is a potential dictator waiting in the wings in Europe who will make Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin look like choir boys. And I feel that there is a good possibility that he is alive today, but again, that's pure speculation. Revelation 13, verse 7 says, also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. Now, I'm surprised that nobody ever asked me how he's going to make war on the saints when I just said that there wouldn't be any true believers in the church. Well, here's how it happens. After the true believers from the church age are raptured away, God is going to reveal himself in a very special way to 144,000 Jews. They will be 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Shoots down the idea of the 10 lost tribes, doesn't it? This can be found in Revelation chapters 7 and 14. These Jews are going to accept Jesus as their Messiah with a vengeance. Now, just imagine this. 144,000 Jewish Billy Grahams are going to be turned loose on the world. These people are the ones that they bring to Christ are going to be the saints that the Antichrist is going to make war with. The church-age believers, that's you and me, will already be in heaven. And the Tribulation Saints will not be involved in the apostate church that was left behind. Well, how does the beast react to all this? All right, go to Revelation chapter 13, verse 6. And it opened his mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. How is this guy going to explain away the fact that a whole bunch of Bible thumpers just suddenly disappeared? He has to discredit them, so he has to blaspheme God, and he has to blaspheme his church, which is dwelling in heaven at the time. Okay, who is going to worship the beast? Revelation 13, verse 8 says, and all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. Well, who was the Lamb that John is referring to? That's an easy one. It's Jesus. Anyone who has not placed his trust in Jesus Christ is going to worship the beast. And since all of the ones within the true church who did place their trust in Jesus Christ will be in heaven at that time, that means all who dwell on the earth will worship it. All right, what about the Tribulation Saints? Well, they won't be saved until the middle of the 7 years of tribulation. So there won't be a single believer on earth until then. They are not supposed to be in here. Okay, before we go any farther, let's turn our attention to Daniel chapter 11, verse 36. This verse from Daniel tells us a little bit about this guy's personality. First, Daniel confirms that he will be an absolute ruler, and the king shall do as he wills. He will not answer to anyone. His rule is going to be absolute. Second, he will exhibit an enormous ego. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. What we have here is an avowed atheist who's going to set himself up as God. There have been many egomaniacs in history, but this guy is going to take the prize. Third, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. And the next verse says, he shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the ones beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He is going to have no respect at all for the traditional religious practices of his forefathers. After all, he thinks he's God. Paul told Timothy, people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving God, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people. In the last days, families will fall apart because people will no longer care about the other members of their families. Children will no longer respect their parents. There will no longer be any respect for heritage or family traditions. Most people will at least pay lip service to the belief of their ancestors, but this guy won't. Fifth, Daniel says, he shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. After all, if you're in control of the entire world and you have absolute power, I'd say that you can have whatever you want. Now, some people claim that the reference to the gods of his fathers indicates that the Antichrist must be Jewish because the Jews would never negotiate a pact with a Gentile. Well, that can't be true because we see several cases in Scripture where the Jews did negotiate agreements with Gentiles. Also, they will say that the phrase, or the one beloved by women, indicates that he has to be homosexual. But I think that the one who is beloved by women is Jesus. The dream of every woman in Israel was to be the mother of the Messiah. After all, the beast has declared that he is God, so why would he pay attention to any other gods but himself? He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. So I think that Daniel is simply saying that this guy will be 100% atheist. He is going to be totally irreligious, but he has such a huge ego that he thinks everybody should worship him. Almost everyone believes in some sort of God. In other words, everyone has something in their life that they value more than anything else. And for many people, that thing replaces God. And this guy is going to be without any religion at all, which means that he doesn't recognize any system of morals. Our world seems to be very ripe to receive a leader like that. People today aren't bothered by a leader who doesn't exhibit a normal family relationship, and infidelity is more expected from our leaders today. The Kennedys are a perfect example of how voters seem to overlook immoral behavior in the candidates that they vote for. It was common knowledge that any woman who married a Kennedy had to put up with their constant infidelity. Senator Ted Kennedy, along with Senator Chris Dodd, were caught creating what became known as a waitress sandwich. Now, if you don't know what that is, see me later and I'll explain it to you. It falls into the realm of sexual assault. But just like Chappaquiddick, people were paid off and nothing happened. And we all know about the exploits of Horn-Dog-in-Chief Bill Clinton. 50 years ago, leaders like that would never have been given a second thought, but integrity doesn't matter anymore. The fact that the Horn-Dog-in-Chief Bill Clinton was re-elected shows that. Clinton was talking about all the flap going on about the illegal campaign contributions he had received, and he said, it's no big deal. 90% of the money that came in was legal. You see, we should be satisfied if our president obeys the law 90% of the time. Not long before he ran for president, Barack Obama tried to rent a car, but every credit card that he had was turned down because he was either maxed out or he was behind in his payments. But when he left office, he bought a 29-acre estate on Martha's Vineyard for $12 million. And just a short time ago, he bought an estate in Hawaii for $19 million. His total salary for the 8 years that he was president was only $3.2 million, and nobody's asking where the rest of that money came from. Homosexuality is considered to be an acceptable lifestyle today, and many of our school systems today are actually promoting it. And anything pertaining to belief in God is no longer allowed in the public arena. In fact, believing in God is actually considered to be a liability. And that's crazy when you consider that our national motto is, in God we trust. Okay, does this guy worship anything at all? Verse 38 says, he shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these, a God whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. His God is going to be military power and wealth. Like every socialist, communist leader in the history, he promises a socialist utopia where everyone is equal and prosperous. But the leaders are the only ones that prosper in a communist society, while the common people live in poverty. The only thing that is equal about a socialist system is that the common people are equally miserable and equally abused. The point is this: he is definitely not a nice guy. In Aldous Huxley's book titled Animal Farm, I would recommend maybe you read it. The pigs that talked the other animals into revolting against the farmer and setting up a communist system with the pigs in charge. The pigs said that doing that would stop the farmer from using their labor for his personal gain, and they could keep whatever they produced for themselves. They told the animals that everything would be shared equally and everyone would prosper. Well, it wasn't long before the animals noticed that the pigs were the only ones who had everything they wanted, and the rest of the animals on the farm were sick and starving. So they got together and they confronted the pigs. They asked why, if everyone was to share equally in what the farm produced, why were they starving and the pigs were living in the lap of luxury? And the pigs' answer was, well, some animals are more equal than others. All right, let's go back to Revelation chapter 13. In this chapter, we also meet the Antichrist sidekick. He's called the second beast. In Revelation chapter 19, verse 20, he's called the false prophet. In Revelation 13, beginning in verse 11, we read, "Then I saw another beast rising out of earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. It performed great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of the people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image of the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it caused all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on their right hand or their forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. There was an ex-Muslim terrorist on TV a few years ago who had converted to Christianity, and he became a Christian pastor. He said that he was startled when he first saw the passage written in the original Greek language. There are no characters in Greek that can be translated directly into 666. The Greek word is hexakosioi. But he says that when he saw those Greek characters, he thought that he was seeing a name written in Arabic. You see, the characters in Greek that are translated 666 are the same characters that are translated Allah in Arabic. And given today's worldly climate, I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Antichrist and the false prophet didn't start out as Muslims, and the mark people will receive is the mark of Allah. After all, the Muslims are waiting for their own Messiah figure called the Mahdi, who is also known as the 12th Imam. Who knows, it's not impossible for the Antichrist to actually claim to be the Mahdi. But that only works if he is a European Muslim. Here's something I bet you don't know. Muslims are also waiting for Jesus. They teach that Islam is the original religion of the world, and they make that claim in spite of the fact that Islam wasn't even invented until the 7th century AD. But they claim that Jesus is a Muslim, and he's very angry with the Christians and Jews because they changed the true religion. So they're waiting for Jesus to return ahead of the Mahdi and destroy all the Christians and Jews in the world in order to make way for the return of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam. At any rate, the second beast will aid and glorify the Antichrist. He is to be the world religious leader. You might call him the Antichrist high priest. And he's going to force people to worship the Antichrist under penalty of death. And how is he going to do that? He's going to control the economy. Now, no one can buy or sell anything or hold a job unless he carries a special mark on his forehead or the back of his right hand. Now that might sound like something that George Lucas might dream up for a Star Wars movie. But we have the technology to do that today. I'm sure that all of you have seen the international product marks that appear on almost everything you buy today. There are a series of black lines that are passed over a laser scanner when you check out the grocery store. Well, why couldn't these same series of marks be tattooed on a person's hand or forehead? Then they could be read by a scanner to make sure that the person is following the beast. And the easiest number for those scanners to read is the number 6. Going a step farther, scientists in Sweden are already working with a Japanese country to develop a computer microchip that can be implanted under the skin. When you pass it over a scanner, it will tell the computer everything about you, even down to your shoe size. Initially, it's been promoted as being a way to carry medical information that could be read by medical personnel in emergencies when you're alone and unconscious. But you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that it can be used for other things as well. My dog already has a similar chip implanted in his neck. Most vets and a lot of animal control shelters already have the scanners necessary to retrieve the information on that chip. What they're trying to do today is to devise a device that where they can update the information without actually removing the chip. All right, let's recap what we've learned so far. First, the events in the world are setting the stage for a dictator to gain power. Second, he won't be known until his fatal hand wound is healed. So any effort to identify him has to be seen as pure speculation. And third, I feel that the current church age believers won't be around to suffer the coolest dictator the world has ever known. Okay, next week we're going it's probably the most controversy in the series. We're going to talk about the mystery battle.